Hello everyone, welcome to this session about the OLAT, which is the Oriental Studies Admissions Test. And I have a few student helpers who are going to be talking about their experience, how they prepared, and hopefully giving you some really useful advice. Before I let them introduce themselves, I'm Sarah, I'm the Access Officer at Mansfield, which is one of the colleges in Oxford. And I have absolutely no experience of Oriental studies. I did history, but that's why I have these lovely helpers here on hand to talk about it instead.
Hello, I'm Annabelle and I'm studying Arabic with subsidiary languages and I'm a first year at Mansfield College.
Hello, my name is Tom. I'm a third year at Mansfield and I study Arabic with classics.
Hiya, I'm Ezra. I'm a second year at Brasenose and I also study Arabic with classics.
Hi, I'm Ailey. I'm a third year and I do Japanese with subsidiary Korean at Hartford.
Great, thank you guys. So first and foremost, we're just going to talk a bit about kind of your own experience of taking the OLAT. So does anyone want to get us started? Just kind of telling us about what it was like to sit the OLAT when you applied.
My school organised for me to go and do the test at a different centre and it was just a half an hour test and I actually quite enjoyed doing it as like silly as it sounds to enjoy doing a test, but it's just basically testing kind of your knowledge and how you kind of can approach a new language, and it's quite fascinating to kind of figure out the grammar and things. But yeah,
I think, yeah, I probably had a similar experience of actually finding it almost fun because it was just so different from any other test I'd ever experienced. There was no sort of expectation of prior knowledge, so it was just everything that you were bringing to the table in that moment, which was sort of quite refreshingly different.
Well, for Japanese, I didn't have to do the OLAT during my application process. It was actually something I had to do prior to my first interview at the Oriental Institute when I came down for interviews. So it was under like a lot shorter, I think, than the actual exam is for most people. And the time we had was only 30 minutes, but we used the answers that we got in that test in our first interview. And it was like our first talking point with the people on the panel. So it was quite interesting. Like I had kind of a similar experience to the others. Like it was kind of fun because it didn't really feel like a test so much. It felt kind of more like, I suppose, problem solving. And then it was quite fun to then like do that and then use that in the interview and kind of talk through how you got there and like listen to the tutors and them discussing like, you know, other ways you could have approached various questions.
Yeah, I also found it quite fun. I think it was just a puzzle. Probably like the first time I did it, I was just a bit scared just because like I didn't get through it all at all. Like I probably got through the first section and that's fine, that's normal. And I feel like what's really good about this test is that if you actually practice, you can really get good at it just because you really develop like a strategy behind it or something. So yeah, I'd say probably like at first it was really scary, but then it got really enjoyable.
So could someone just give us kind of a brief overview of what the test actually involves, like in terms of what you're expected to do?
There's just a made up language that you get presented with. And it changes every year, I think, what language it is. And there's like some example sentences with like translations into English. And then you're basically supposed to kind of use like deduction, I suppose, and try and notice grammar and tenses and potentially like masculine and feminine endings, like just trying to navigate your way through what each word could mean. And then there's some bits where it says, okay, now try and write this in this language, or what would this be in English? And it's like basically like the others were saying, it basically is kind of like a puzzle. You have to kind of work out what bit from the previous English translations could mean what, and then you just kind of have to put it together.
Great, thank you. That's really useful. So how did you kind of prepare, and what did you find useful when you were preparing? Particularly, obviously, now you've spent some time actually doing your subject. Are there things that you think would have been helpful to know when you were sitting the test?
You don't really need to prepare way before like the test itself. Like I guess like maybe 3 weeks before you can start actually preparing, just because like I think if you start preparing too early, like you kind of need to be in the right mind frame by the time you're sitting the test. And so if you start too early, you won't be that mindful, in my opinion. So what I say would be the most important thing to do would just be past papers. And unfortunately, when I set the test, there was just one past paper available online, whereas now I saw, and there are like quite a few with solutions as well, which is always useful. And so do those over a time period, I'd say, and always like practice them under time conditions, just because like 30 minutes for this test is literally nothing. So I guess like even when you're doing that, be like actually doing them when you're stressed and in the right like time is helpful. And also I also did practice some classics aptitude tests as well, just because it's kind of a similar test, or as in like picking up a language and analyzing it. And then what I found most useful was probably like, as I said before, like having a strategy behind it. So for me, it was like highlighting like words that were the same and find, like, for example, which is a really good like way of approaching it. Just like, since you have like the language and translations right next to it, you like pick up words that are the same. Like, I don't know, for example, man, and then you see whether in the plural it's different, how it works. And so you can start figuring out the language. And then like, I normally would like write next to my sentences like a little table and so as you go through the language, you can go back and like use those tables to then like translate what you need.
I think what Tommaso was saying about sort of keeping track of things is really important, like keeping a sort of vocab list, so that when you do come to sort of the later sections, you're not scrabbling back, trying to be like, oh God, what sentence was that when that last thing came up? I guess what's really important as well is to kind of think about what sort of things are going to come up. Like we were talking about changing gender or changing a verb from singular to a plural conjugation is probably quite likely to come up, but worrying about word order, for example, which is important to some language, it's quite unlikely in a 30-minute test that they're going to throw you something about word order. So kind of focusing on the things that are likely to be changing in the language and thinking about the ways that they do change in a language that you do speak could be quite useful as well.
I believe at the start of the test as well, they give you like a brief paragraph of the different kind of rules in this made up language. So if it is gender specific or if it has plurals and singulars, and how if it does have a word order, which like Ezra says it probably won't have. But so that's always helpful. Like I found helpful like the different rules it does give you to highlight them and kind of remember them. And again, like Tom said, to look at the different order of the words in the examples given and kind of pick out words that are repeated in each sentence. But definitely just going over past papers and doing them in time recordings, like get someone to time you and come in when it's over. And I think that gives you the confidence as well to see that maybe you won't get through the whole paper and that's okay. Like it's a time kind of situation, and not to put too much pressure on yourself for actually getting right to the end of the paper. Like it's okay to just do as much as you can to like a better standard than rushing through it all and completing it but not to the same sort of standard.
Yeah, I mean, when I came for like interviews, because obviously I didn't have to do the OLAT for my application, I didn't actually know that I was gonna have to do it before my interview, so it was quite a surprise. So I literally didn't prepare at all. And I know that some people did, but a lot of people who I met interviews had no idea this was something you had to do for Japanese. So it was very much like a kind of work it out in that moment sort of scenario. However, like everyone said, like once you kind of get this like key and it tells you what's basically going to come up, it was just kind of important to remember what you'd seen, make note of it, and then like everyone else has said as well, like it is timed, it's so short, like not to stress about getting to the end or like trying to make it perfect or anything. It's very much just kind of like, I suppose, going on instinct as well with certain things. Yeah, I didn't prepare much for it, but I still found that like in the moment it wasn't as intimidating as I thought it was going to be, and it actually was somewhat enjoyable to some extent.
And actually, just picking up on what you guys were just saying, the next question is, how do you approach difficult questions? So if you just come across something that you're like, I just have no idea what's going on, you know, what would be your advice for that? Is it better to just like leave it or have a go? What do you do kind of in that moment, considering the pressure that you might be feeling because you're sitting an exam?
I'd definitely say have a go. At least if you're doing Japanese, you will be asked about it in interview. So like if you have no answer, it's better to have something that you tried rather than nothing, because they will probably question you on that. But at the same time, not to focus too much on it or get too stressed about it, because it really is like quite a long paper considering the time. And I think that especially if you're, you know, worried about getting to the end, it's better to kind of at least maybe take some time, do something else, and then go back to it if you have the time, of course. But definitely attempting questions rather than leaving them blank, because maybe you attempt it, maybe you get it wrong, but the examiner will still be able to see from your answer like where your thought process was, and that's kind of what's most important here, I think.
In terms of sort of moving on and coming back, well, that can be quite good to sort of like break out if you're having difficulty and think about something else and then come back to it with a sort of fresh look. It's also true that the exercises kind of build on each other. So you'll be introduced to like simpler forms, and then by the end, they might have introduced like a past tense, for example. So if you do skip something, there is the possibility that it contains a piece of information about the language that could be really important later on. So that is worth bearing in mind. If you do skip it and then you're thinking, oh God, I've got no idea when did this happen, it might be in the bit that you skipped. And so it might be worth coming back to it at that point.
Okay, well, if people don't have anything more to say on that question, I think it might be useful if we just like look through a past paper together, especially as some of you mentioned like certain parts of it. So this is kind of vaguely what the past paper will look like. You know, the front of it is pretty standard stuff in terms of, you know, you putting in your information, and all of the, as with like any test, it's really important to make sure you read the front page. So, you know, things like your timing, the question paper, what you're expected to answer, where you're expected to leave blank or whatever. So it's really important that you do read that. And then kind of, I think, was it Annabelle or Tom who mentioned a bit about getting a little paragraph about like some of the words and stuff. So do you maybe want to get us started on that?
Yeah, so you get given a little paragraph, and like you can see in the example, it will give you the idea of what kind of things the language features and the rules it has. So if it has feminine and masculine, or if it has, like this example, if it differentiates between like the progressive tense, so if goes and going is the same, or if they have different words for those. And I just found it really useful to kind of highlight the things. I mean, some things are already in bold, so you kind of get the idea that these things are going to be important. But if you just read through it carefully and look through the specific rules that they give you and just highlight them, I find it really helpful to like be able to remember these points and then apply them in the questions.
I think the first thing for me would be that sort of looking at it initially, it's quite scary and intimidating. So just kind of approaching it in at the start, a very simple way. So for example, in the first example sentence, you got Bic, which just sort of stands out to me, probably being the first word. So then you could like scan down, and then you can see it again in the fifth one down. And so then you just sort of compare the sentences, and you can see that Bic probably means gin, and just kind of like small victories like that right off the bat, just focusing on little simple things rather than kind of trying to do too much is probably a good idea to just sort of ease yourself in from the beginning and not to get too intimidated.
Yeah, I agree with that. For example, so if you look at the translations, there are 3 sentences with beggar and beggars. So like if you compare them, you understand that beggar is probably barbug, and then from there you can start working out how to form the plural. So in this case, barbug is probably the plural of beggar, and then yeah, you can start like comparing other words and how they change depending on like the sentence, whether they're singular or plural, or whether they're a subject or an object.
So is it kind of worth flicking, like just having a look through all of these before you start tackling like one by one? And as you were both saying there, making sure that if there are like certain words that come up again, that you're kind of making those connections?
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely this first section with the sort of sentences from the language to English is probably actually like, at least for me, when I was doing it, was the most important part, because it was the first time seeing the language. I'd never really done anything like this, and like the others were saying, it was, that's when I spent the time kind of making sure I could try and work out, well, to my best of my ability in the time, trying to work out what word could mean what, where I saw it again, and then just making note of that, like everyone said, like in a key or something, or with highlighter or something like that, just because those words would maybe come up again later, maybe in slightly different form, but it's just so that I never had to like go back and recheck what those could be.
I think it's worth also noting the words that you don't initially get a definition for. For example, in the first section, I think there's the verb request, which isn't in any of the other sentences. So there's no way to kind of, perhaps there's no way to work it out by deduction, but then in another section, there probably will be a sentence with that word in. And so then sort of keeping it in mind so you can double check your theory later on. If they've been sneaky and haven't given you any way to do that in the first section is a good idea as well.
Also, I think like rather than rushing through it, if you actually really focus on the first section, for example, you really get a lot of rules for the next sections as well. So I guess like the paper as well, like rather than like rushing through it all and like answer everything, you should probably like focus more on like quality of your answer, so that you can actually show that you thought through it and you've actually understood the rules that you've picked up.
So in terms of just approaching the questions, is it the sort of paper where you should like annotate on the actual paper itself, or do you want to ask for extra paper? I know that might, or make your notes elsewhere. I know it might seem like a small point, but it's probably be interesting to hear what you guys did.
I annotated a lot on my paper, like my paper was full. I think it's quite difficult because you're trying to make so many notes to keep the like different words that you have figured out clear, because a lot of the time you do use them later. So I think it's important to kind of create an area on the paper, or like ask for spare paper where you can write down the words that you have figured out. So when you are drawing, like I drew lots of arrows and highlighting, you don't kind of get confused in like the muddling or the mess of like, I know for me, like the annotations that I made. So I think it's good to definitely note down, because I think it's like it's good to show you're working out, like it's not like in maths and stuff, but like it's good to show you're working out, because they want to kind of see how you've come to your answer and how you're kind of thinking about figuring out the language and things like that, like talking through it almost out through writing it down. And I think that helps a lot. It helped me a lot, like with the test itself, like figuring out different bits, and then you also have it written down that you can come back to it and think, oh, that is what this bit means. But I think definitely try and make it clear, the words you do figure out, like display them in a clear way so you can come back to them and look at them as well.
And Ailey, I'm sure it's like even more important if you're going to go into an interview to talk about it, to take like clear notes and actually keep your thoughts quite organized.
Yeah, I mean, like after I did my the 30-minute test, like I think I went into my interview maybe 10 minutes later. So yeah, for me it was very, very important that I basically just wrote down absolutely everything that I was thinking at the time, because what they do in the interview is they ask you your thought process on how you answered every question that you, as many questions as you can sort of get through during the interview time. So it's very important to make note of what words you think could mean what you didn't understand, what you kind of want to potentially ask about even, because like at least from my perspective, it was kind of used as a talking point, a beginning point for the interview. So it was quite important to be able to not just talk about my own, working out, but then I was also able to ask questions and, kind of ask them how I should have approached certain things as well. So yeah, definitely, I think my paper looked quite illegible by the end of it, but I guess that's a good thing too.
And just to kind of like wrap up, what piece of advice would you guys give to students who are in the position where they're thinking of applying for Oriental Studies, thinking about like the admissions test and stuff. And before you start, there's just a few things I want to say, which is, one, please make sure you register for the test. You do have to register separately to the UCAS application. And if you don't, you can just talk to your school and hopefully they should be able to help you with that. But it's really, really important that you do remember to register. And second of all, I'm sure this is, particularly important with something like Oriental Studies, but remembering that the admissions tests are not supposed to be like knowledge based. It's about the skills that you've gained from doing all your different subjects and your interest in the subject that you're applying for. And so when you look at a past paper, if you think, oh my God, this looks really hard, then that's completely normal. That's what we want people to think when they look at it. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear from the students what their piece of advice would be.
I think the point you made about it being not knowledge-based in the test is very important. Because I guess if you can't find a piece of information in the paper, that's not to say that they haven't included it. Everything that you need to answer the paper is there, because they can't be relying on anything that you might know from outside. I remember in my one I sat, we got to the vocab item for stallion, and then later it asked us to translate mare. And so I was panicking, looking through, trying to find where they'd given us mare, and then I realized they hadn't. They were just asking us to switch the gender of the original word. So it's things like that, just taking a pause and remembering that everything you need is in the paper. You just have to be careful about it.
I would definitely say, in terms of for Japanese, like, because it isn't an exam that you do prior to coming to interview, it's not something that a lot of people do prepare for. Like, a lot of people, it is quite a surprise when they find out this is something that like they have to do too. So it really shouldn't be about worrying about completing it or getting correct answers. It really is just sort of a way to show your thought process when it comes to learning or analysing language. And that because it is something that's used in interview, like I've said quite a few times already, but it is just a talking point, and it really is just something that you can use to demonstrate your own understanding and the way that you approach languages, but also you can use it to ask questions as well. Like, it shouldn't be that intimidating. So I wouldn't worry so much about needing to feel like you have to do loads of preparation for it. Of course, like now there are more past papers and things available online, so you can do your preparation. However, it is very much something that they use to just kind of get to know how you think about things, and then from there the interview then progresses. So it's not all just 100% focused on that test. So it shouldn't be too daunting.
Also, I say, like, it can be said about like the whole application process in general, but like people, especially for these courses, you don't really study Arabic or Japanese before coming here. They don't really expect you to know lots about both this test, but also lots about, I don't know, Arabic, Islamic history, for example. So do not be scared to apply, and do not be scared to like apply when you feel like you don't know enough, because I therefore did not really know anything about the Middle East before applying, and I still got in. So I feel like it's really important to bear in mind that the interviewers as well will not really expect you to know everything about it before coming here. It's a learning process, and you're applying to like learn about your degree, not to come here already prepared for it.
Yeah, I think just don't put too much pressure on yourself. Remember that the test is just kind of one element of the application as well. Like, it's looked at holistically, so that's the right, like, everything is kind of considered, your interview, your paper you send in, like, so don't try and put too much pressure on it, and just kind of enjoy the process. If, like, I know tests can be very stressful and things, but just try and go in there and, as cliche as it sounds, do your best, and just, it's okay if like you don't finish the paper. Just try not to put pressure on yourself and just try to enjoy it, really.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking time out of your day to come and talk to some of the prospective students about the OLAT admissions test. And I think the only thing left for us to say is like good luck. And as everyone said, try and have fun. And if you do have any questions, it's always worth reaching out to the department or to a college that you know offers it and you might be interested in applying to, and they might also help put you in touch with a current student if you'd like that. But yeah, thank you for watching and good luck. Bye.